September 7th, 1940, 23,000 feet above the Thames estuary. Hauptmann Werner Milders couldn't suppress his grin as he watched the ungainly biplane wallowing through the air below his Messerschmitt 109. The fabric-covered anachronism looked like it had escaped from a museum, all struts and wires and fixed landing gear hanging beneath like a child who'd forgotten to tuck in their shirt. "Doppeldecker," he transmitted to his wingman, barely containing his amusement. "A double-winger. They're sending biplanes against us now. The RAF must be scraping the bottom of the barrel." The Gloucester Gladiator, Britain's last biplane fighter, represented everything the Luftwaffe had already consigned to history. While German pilots flew sleek modern monoplanes capable of 350 miles per hour, the British were apparently dusting off relics from the previous war. 4 fabric-covered wings catching the wind, a radial engine that wheezed rather than roared, and a top speed that barely exceeded 250 miles per hour. In the modern aerial warfare of 1940, it was a death trap masquerading as a fighter. What Milders didn't know, what none of the Luftwaffe pilots circling like sharks above the English Channel could have imagined, was that this obsolete biplane would hold the line during Britain's darkest hour. That before the war ended, these flying antiques would fight from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma. That German pilots would learn to respect the outdated British fighter, not despite its limitations, but because of the desperate courage of the men who flew it. The mathematics of disaster were already written across Britain's order of battle that September morning. The RAF had begun the Battle of Britain with barely 700 modern fighters. Hurricanes and Spitfires were being shot down faster than factories could replace them. Pilots were dying faster than training schools could produce replacements. And in the background, waiting in the shadows like a forgotten reserve, sat 137 Gloucester Gladiators, biplanes in a monoplane war, relics that would have to become warriors. The Gloucester Gladiator had been obsolete before it even entered service. That's the brutal truth that defined everything about this aircraft and the men who flew it. When the Air Ministry ordered the first Gladiators in July 1935, the world was already moving beyond biplanes. The American Boeing P-26 Peashooter, a modern monoplane fighter, had flown a year earlier. The German Messerschmitt 109 was already on drawing boards in Bavaria. Yet Britain ordered 231 Gladiators anyway, the last gasp of biplane fighter development. The aircraft that emerged from Gloucester's factory at Hucklecote looked impressive in a Victorian sort of way. 4 wings stacked in pairs, each covered in Irish linen, stretched tight over metal framework. A Bristol Mercury 9-cylinder radial engine producing 840 horsepower, enough to push the 7,000-pound fighter to 257 miles per hour in level flight. The armament seemed adequate for 1935. 4 Browning .303 machine guns, 2 mounted in the fuselage firing through the propeller arc, 2 more in fairings under the lower wings. The synchronized guns could fire 600 rounds per minute each. Against fabric-covered biplanes of the early 30s, this firepower was devastating. Against modern fighters with metal construction and armor plate, it was barely adequate. Squadron leader Peter Townsend, who would fly Gladiators during the desperate early months of the war, later wrote about his first impression of the aircraft. She looked like a dragonfly that had somehow survived into the age of eagles. Beautiful in her own antiquated way, but hopelessly outmatched by modern fighters. We knew it. The Germans knew it. The only question was whether courage could compensate for obsolescence. The specifications told the story of a fighter already outdated. Maximum speed of 257 miles per hour at 14,000 feet. Ceiling of 33,000 feet. Though at that altitude, the Gladiator wallowed like a drunk trying to walk a straight line. Rate of climb was 2,300 feet per minute at sea level. Range of 440 miles on internal fuel. Compare those numbers to the Messerschmitt 109E, the Luftwaffe's standard fighter in 1940. Top speed of 354 miles per hour. Ceiling of 36,000 feet. Climb rate of 3,000 feet per minute. The German fighter was faster, climbed better, and could reach higher. In every measurable category, the Gladiator was outclassed. But numbers don't tell the whole story. The Gladiator possessed qualities that couldn't be measured on a specification sheet. She was extraordinarily maneuverable. Those 4 wings and the relatively low wing loading meant she could turn inside anything the Germans flew. She was stable as a rock, a gun platform that made accurate shooting almost easy. She was forgiving of pilot error, important when green pilots with minimal training were being rushed to the front. And she was tough. The metal framework could absorb tremendous punishment, bringing pilots home with damage that would have destroyed a monoplane. Flying Officer George Burgess, who flew Gladiators with No. 80 Squadron in the Middle East, described the aircraft's handling. She was like flying a very fast tiger moth, completely docile, utterly predictable. You could haul her around the sky with abandon, pull maneuvers that would tear the wings off a hurricane, and she just kept flying. The problem was doing all that ballet at half the speed of the enemy. By September 1939, when war began, the RAF had already begun withdrawing Gladiators from frontline service. The plan was simple. Modern Hurricanes and Spitfires would defend Britain. The obsolete biplanes would be shipped to quiet sectors, training units, and colonial outposts where they might never see combat. The Air Ministry assumed the coming war would be short, decisive, fought by modern aircraft. They were catastrophically wrong. April 9, 1940. Dawn over Irland, Norway. Flight Lieutenant Alvin Williams of No. 263 Squadron sat in his Gladiator's cramped cockpit, watching German Heinkel 111s droning toward the airfield. The bombers came in perfect formation, utterly confident. Why wouldn't they be? British biplanes against the might of the Luftwaffe. Williams pushed the throttle forward. The Bristol Mercury engine coughed, caught, then roared to life. Around him, 17 other Gladiators were starting up, the last line of defense for a crumbling Norway campaign. These aircraft had been shipped to Norway in crates, assembled in freezing warehouses by ground crews who'd never seen a Gladiator before. Many lacked gun sights. Some had propellers salvaged from crashed aircraft. They were flying on hope and borrowed parts. What happened next shocked everyone, including Williams. The Gladiators, despite being outnumbered and outclassed, tore into the German formations with savage determination. Williams's combat report, filed 3 days later before evacuating Norway, was clinically precise. Engaged formation of 6 He-111s at 8,000 feet, closed to 50 yards before opening fire. First bomber began smoking immediately, continued firing into second bomber, which exploded. Third bomber jettisoned bombs and dove away trailing fuel. In less than 2 minutes, Williams had destroyed 2 German bombers and damaged a third. His Gladiator had taken hits from defensive fire, holes punched through the fabric wings, but kept flying. By the time the brief Norwegian campaign ended, No. 263 Squadron's Gladiators had shot down 26 German aircraft confirmed, with another 11 probables. They'd lost 10 Gladiators, but only 3 pilots. The obsolete biplane had bloodied the Luftwaffe's nose. The Norwegian campaign taught the RAF several crucial lessons about the Gladiator. First, while hopelessly outmatched against modern fighters in level flight, the biplane's maneuverability gave it a fighting chance in turning combat. Second, the stable gun platform made even inexperienced pilots deadly shots at close range. Third, and most important, the Gladiator's toughness meant pilots could bring damaged aircraft home, surviving to fight another day. Hauptmann Helmut Wick, who would become one of Germany's top aces, encountered Gladiators over Norway and recorded his impressions. The British biplanes are no threat in modern air combat. They are too slow to catch our bombers, too vulnerable to our fighters. However, if engaged in a turning fight at low altitude, they are surprisingly dangerous. The pilots show remarkable aggression, closing to point-blank range before firing. Our standing order is to use speed and altitude advantage, never turn with them. Malta was where the Gladiator became legendary. The tiny Mediterranean island sitting astride Axis supply lines to North Africa found itself under siege beginning in June 1940. When Italy declared war, Malta's air defense consisted of exactly 3 Gladiators, 3 obsolete biplanes defending an island fortress against the full might of the Italian Air Force. The 3 aircraft were quickly nicknamed Faith, Hope, and Charity by the islanders, though historians later discovered this was partly myth. There were actually more than 3 Gladiators on Malta, but only 3 were serviceable at any given time. The others served as parts donors, stripped for components to keep the Flying 3 operational. Flight Lieutenant George Burgess flew the first combat mission from Malta on June 11, 1940. His target was a formation of 10 Italian SM-79 bombers approaching the island, one Gladiator against 10 bombers. The mathematics seemed suicidal. Burgess attacked anyway. I positioned myself above and behind the formation, Burgess reported, selected the rear aircraft and dove, firing from 100 yards. The bomber's port engine began streaming smoke, pulled up, came around for another pass. This time targeted the formation leader. Good strikes on the fuselage. The formation broke up and jettisoned their bombs into the sea. For the next 6 weeks, Malta's handful of Gladiators flew multiple sorties daily, sometimes hourly, fighting off Italian raids. The pilots were exhausted, flying until they could barely climb out of the cockpit. The ground crews worked miracles, patching fabric, scavenging parts, keeping the ancient biplanes flying through sheer determination. Against all odds, Malta's air defense held. The Italian pilots, flying modern Fiat G50 and Machi C-200 monoplanes, initially dismissed the British biplanes. That confidence died quickly. On June 22nd, pilot officer Peter Hartley engaged 6 Fiat G50s at 12,000 feet. The Italian fighters had every advantage: speed, modern design, numerical superiority. Hartley didn't care. He pulled his Gladiator into a vertical climb, something the heavier Italian fighters couldn't match, then half-rolled and dove onto the formation. The lead Fiat exploded under his guns. The others scattered. Hartley pursued one, closing to 30 yards before firing. The Italian fighter came apart in midair. 2 kills in less than 3 minutes. The surviving Italian pilots fled. Post-war Italian records revealed that pilots reported the British biplanes flew like they were guided by madmen who feared nothing. By August 1940, Malta had received hurricane reinforcements, and the Gladiators were gradually withdrawn from frontline service. But they'd accomplished the impossible. For 2 months, a handful of obsolete biplanes had denied the Italian Air Force control of Maltese skies. They'd shot down over 40 Italian aircraft confirmed, with another 20 probables. The cost was 14 Gladiators destroyed and 4 pilots killed. The psychological impact exceeded the tactical achievement. Every Italian pilot who encountered Malta's Gladiators learned that modern aircraft meant nothing without skilled pilots and determination. The myth of invincible modern fighters died over Malta, shot down by pilots flying antiques. The Western Desert offered a different kind of warfare, one that would prove the Gladiators' worth in unexpected ways. When Italy invaded Egypt from Libya in September 1940, the RAF's desert squadrons were equipped with a motley collection of aircraft. Among them were 4 squadrons of Gladiators, numbers 33, 80, 112, and 3 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force. The desert was supposed to be where modern warfare happened. Fast-moving tank columns, mechanized infantry, air superiority through numbers and technology. Instead, it became the last great arena where obsolete aircraft could still make a difference. The distances were vast, the logistics impossible, and replacement parts non-existent. Simplicity and toughness mattered more than speed and sophistication. Flight Lieutenant Marmaduke Paddle of No. 33 Squadron embodied what made the Gladiator dangerous in the right hands. A South African with a gift for deflection shooting and zero fear, Paddle flew the obsolete biplane like it was a Spitfire. His combat reports read like adventure fiction, except every word was verified by witnesses. December 4th, 1940. Paddle was leading a section of 3 Gladiators on patrol when they encountered 50-plus Italian fighters escorting bombers toward British positions. 50 against 3. Paddle attacked immediately. Dove through the fighter escort, his report stated. Selected bomber on the right side of formation, closed to point-blank range and fired. Bomber caught fire immediately and fell out of formation. Pulled up through the formation, engaged a Fiat that attempted to follow. Short burst at 50 yards. Enemy fighter spun into the desert. Re-engaged bomber formation. Second bomber destroyed with 3-second burst. In less than 10 minutes, Paddle had destroyed 3 Italian aircraft. His wingmen, inspired by his aggression, accounted for 2 more. The Italian formation broke off the attack. 5 obsolete biplanes had turned back a force 10 times their size. Paddle would eventually be credited with at least 40 victories, possibly as many as 50, making him potentially the top Allied ace of the entire war. Most of those kills came while flying Gladiators. His tactics became standard doctrine for desert Gladiator pilots. Use superior maneuverability to get close. Aim. Carefully fire in short bursts to conserve ammunition, and never ever show fear. The desert environment proved oddly suited to the Gladiator's limitations. The aircraft's relatively short range meant nothing when both sides operated from airfields only miles apart. The lack of speed mattered less when most combat occurred at low altitude, where Italian fighters lost their performance advantage. The simple radial engine lacking complex liquid cooling systems shrugged off the abusive desert heat that grounded more sophisticated aircraft. Wing Commander Patrick Dunn, commanding No. 33 Squadron, wrote in his diary about the Gladiator's reliability. In 6 months of desert operations, we've had precisely 3 engine failures, 3 out of thousands of sorties. The Mercury radial is indestructible. You can blow holes through the cylinders, lose half the cooling fins, and she keeps running. We've landed aircraft that looked like Swiss cheese, fixed them with fabric patches and wire, and sent them back up the next day. The ground war in the desert saw Gladiators employed increasingly for ground attack work. The aircraft could carry 2 250-pound bombs under the lower wings, turning the obsolete fighter into a capable light bomber. More importantly, the stable gun platform and low-speed handling made it ideal for strafing attacks on Axis columns. Squadron leader Peter Wycombe Barnes described a typical ground attack mission. We'd take off at dawn, fly at 50 feet to avoid detection, then pop up over a ridge to find Italian truck columns. The Gladiator could slow to 130 miles per hour for the attack run. Absurdly slow by modern standards, but perfect for placing bullets accurately into vehicles. The Italians would scatter, firing back with machine guns and light anti-aircraft guns. We'd shoot up a dozen trucks, pull up, and be gone before they could react. The Gladiator's fabric covering proved surprisingly resistant to small arms fire. Bullets punched clean holes through the linen without causing structural damage. Ground fire that would have ignited fuel tanks in modern fighters often passed harmlessly through the Gladiator's structure. Pilots returned from missions with hundreds of bullet holes, the fabric flapping in the slipstream, yet still flying. By spring 1941, the desert campaign saw Gladiators operating alongside more modern Hurricanes. The tactical doctrine that emerged used each aircraft's strengths. Hurricanes would engage enemy fighters at altitude, drawing them into dogfights. Gladiators would attack at low level, targeting bombers and ground targets, while the enemy fighters were distracted. The obsolete biplane had found its niche. The Italian pilots developed grudging respect for the British biplanes. Capitano Franco Lucchini, who would become one of Italy's top aces with 26 victories, encountered Gladiators repeatedly over the desert. In his diary, he wrote, "The British Gladiator is an insult to modern aviation, a flying relic that should be in museums. Yet they are flown by pilots of exceptional skill and aggression. Engage them in a turning fight at low altitude, and you will likely die. Our standing orders are clear. Maintain speed advantage, attack from above, never follow them down into the valleys where they operate like eagles in their natural environment." October 28, 1940. Mussolini's Italy invaded Greece, expecting a swift victory. The Greeks had other ideas. So did No. 80 Squadron, equipped with 14 Gladiators, which arrived to support the Greek Air Force in November. What followed became one of the Gladiator's finest hours. The terrain over Greece was mountainous, brutal, unforgiving. Modern fighters struggled with the thin air at altitude and the violent turbulence in the valleys. The Gladiator, with its light wing, loading, and forgiving handling, operated in conditions that grounded more sophisticated aircraft. Squadron leader Marmaduke Paddle, transferred from the desert to lead 80 Squadron's Gladiator flight, immediately established air superiority over impossible odds. On November 19th, he led 6 Gladiators against 27 Italian fighters. The mathematics seemed suicidal. Paddle attacked anyway. The combat lasted 40 minutes, a whirling dogfight through Greek mountain valleys at altitudes ranging from 100 feet to 15,000. Paddle's Gladiator turned inside every Italian fighter that engaged him. He fired in short, precise bursts, his deflection shooting legendary among pilots who witnessed it. When the combat ended, 5 Italian fighters were destroyed, confirmed. Paddle personally claimed 3. Flight Lieutenant Wood Scowen, Paddle's wingman, described the engagement. Paddle flew like the gladiator was an extension of his body. He'd pull vertical, roll inverted, and dive onto an enemy fighter before they realized where he'd gone. The Italian pilots were good, experienced from Spain and the desert, but they'd never encountered someone who could use an obsolete biplane as a weapon of precision. The Greek campaign saw gladiators operating under conditions that would be considered impossible by modern standards. Airfields were muddy fields. Maintenance was performed in freezing rain. Spare parts arrived by donkey train. Ammunition was rationed to 10 rounds per gun per mission at one point. None of it mattered. The pilots made every bullet count. On February 28, 1941, Paddle achieved a combat performance that remains debated by historians. Leading 4 gladiators, he intercepted a formation of 40-plus Italian aircraft attacking Greek positions. The standing order for outnumbered RAF fighters was to report and evade. Paddle ignored it and attacked. What happened next was witnessed by dozens of soldiers on the ground. The 5 British biplanes tore through the Italian formation like wolves among sheep. Paddle destroyed 3 aircraft in the first pass. He pulled vertical, rolled out above the formation, and dove again. 2 more Italian fighters fell. The entire engagement lasted less than 15 minutes. Paddle landed with 7 rounds remaining in all 4 guns combined. His Gladiator had taken hits from multiple Italian fighters, the fabric flapping in strips from the wings, but flew perfectly. His official combat report, preserved in RAF archives, listed 5 confirmed victories and 2 probables. Ground observers claimed they'd seen 7 Italian aircraft crash. Whether 5 or 7, it was an astonishing achievement. The Italian pilots facing Paddle and 80 Squadron began refusing missions. This wasn't cowardice. It was rational self-preservation. Post-war Italian records revealed that between November 1940 and February 1941, gladiators over Greece destroyed 87 Italian aircraft confirmed. The loss rate for Italian bomber crews attacking Greek positions covered by RAF gladiators exceeded 40%. Tenente Vittorio Minguzzi, an Italian fighter pilot who survived the Greek campaign, later wrote, "We had been told the British sent obsolete biplanes because they had nothing else. This was true. What they didn't tell us was these biplanes were flown by the most skilled and aggressive pilots in the RAF. Each combat was a lesson in humility. Our modern Fiats had every advantage except the most important one, the skill and determination of the man in the cockpit." The Greek campaign ended in defeat for Britain when Germany intervened in April 1941. The Gladiators of 80 Squadron flew until the very end, covering the evacuation of British troops. Of the 14 Gladiators that arrived in Greece, 13 were destroyed or abandoned. Every single pilot survived, testament to the aircraft's ability to bring damaged planes home. While Spitfires and Hurricanes fought over England, Gladiators were waging their own desperate war in theaters historians barely remember. The East African campaign saw obsolete biplanes fighting in jungles and across deserts that stretched beyond imagination. The aircraft designed for European warfare found itself operating from crude airstrips carved from bush, maintained by ground crews improvising with whatever materials they could find. Numbers 3 and 237 squadrons, equipped with Gladiators, arrived in East Africa in early 1941. Their mission was to support British and Commonwealth forces fighting Italian colonial armies in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland. The distances were staggering, the logistics impossible, the enemy well entrenched. Flight Lieutenant Gordon Haywood of No. 3 Squadron described the conditions. "We operated from dirt strips so rough they'd be condemned as farmland back home. The heat reached 120 degrees in the shade. There was no shade. Our aircraft sat in open desert, fabric baking in the sun, metal too hot to touch. We'd fly before dawn or after dusk, the only times the air was cool enough for the engines to produce full power." The Gladiator proved surprisingly well-suited for colonial warfare. The robust construction handled rough field landings that would have destroyed delicate modern fighters. The simple radial engine required minimal maintenance, crucial when spare parts took months to arrive. The short takeoff run meant operating from airstrips barely longer than a cricket pitch. Combat in East Africa differed from Europe. The Italian Air Force there flew an eclectic mix of obsolete and modern aircraft, everything from Fiat CR-42 biplanes to modern SM-79 bombers. The Gladiator, obsolete by European standards, found itself facing opponents of comparable capability. The result was combat that resembled the First World War more than modern aerial warfare. On March 2, 1941, Flight Lieutenant Derek Westenray led 3 Gladiators on a patrol that encountered 12 Italian aircraft attacking Commonwealth ground forces. The Italian formation included both CR-42 biplanes and more modern monoplanes. What followed was a confusing melee where obsolete British biplanes fought obsolete Italian biplanes while modern Italian monoplanes tried to intervene. Westenray's combat report captured the chaos. Engaged enemy formation at 5,000 feet. Initial pass destroyed 1 CR-42. Pulled into vertical climb, engaged second biplane at stall speed. Short burst at 20 yards. Enemy aircraft spun into ground. Dove away from monoplane fighters, used superior low-speed handling to reverse onto their tails. Third victory confirmed when enemy fighter flew into hillside attempting to escape. The Italian colonial forces surrendered in November 1941, ending the East African campaign. The 2 Gladiator squadrons had destroyed over 90 Italian aircraft confirmed, with another 40 probables. They'd lost 27 Gladiators, but only 8 pilots. The obsolete biplane had dominated a forgotten theater through sheer determination. The most bizarre chapter in the Gladiators' combat history occurred above the Arctic Circle. When Germany invaded Norway in April 1940, a handful of Gladiators found themselves fighting in conditions no aircraft had been designed for. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. Daylight lasted 20 hours in summer, barely 4 in winter. The operational challenges made combat almost secondary. Number 4-6 Squadron operated Gladiators from frozen lakes in northern Norway during the brief Allied presence there. The aircraft were fitted with skis instead of wheels, transforming them into the world's most unlikely bush planes. The fabric covering froze solid, making the control surfaces stiff. The oil congealed in the engine unless heated before every flight. The machine guns jammed from ice unless constantly maintained. Flight Lieutenant Caesar Hull described starting a Gladiator in Arctic conditions. You'd arrive at the aircraft 2 hours before takeoff. First, build a fire under the engine using whatever wood you could scavenge. Wait for the oil to thaw. Hand pump fuel into the engine because the electric pumps had frozen. Prime each cylinder individually. Spin the propeller by hand until your arms burned. Maybe if you were lucky, she'd catch. More often, you'd start over and try again. Once airborne, the Gladiators proved remarkably capable in Arctic warfare. The slow speed and tight turning radius meant they could operate from tiny frozen lakes that no other aircraft could use. The rugged construction absorbed damage from forced landings on ice. The simple systems meant fewer components to freeze or fail. On April 26, 1940, Hull led 2 Gladiators against 15 German Heinkel bombers attacking Allied ships in Narvik Harbor. The mathematics were impossible. 2 obsolete biplanes against 15 modern bombers. Hull attacked from directly below the formation, where the German gunners had limited fields of fire. Closed to 50 yards before opening fire, Hull reported. First, Heinkel caught fire immediately and fell away. Continued climbing through formation, firing at second bomber. Good strikes observed. Enemy aircraft left formation trailing smoke. Wingman destroyed third bomber. German formation abandoned attack and fled. 3 kills against 15 bombers. The Germans would not return to Narvik while Hull's Gladiators were operational. The obsolete biplane had become the guardian of an Arctic harbor through sheer audacity. The Norwegian campaign ended in Allied withdrawal, but the Gladiator had proven it could fight anywhere, under any conditions. From tropical jungles to Arctic tundra, from desert sand to Mediterranean islands, the obsolete biplane had performed when more modern aircraft failed. By late 1941, the Gladiator was finally, truly obsolete. New aircraft were arriving at the front in numbers that made the old biplane irrelevant. Hurricanes, Spitfires, and later American fighters like the P-40 Tomahawk possessed the speed and firepower modern warfare demanded. The Gladiator was withdrawn from frontline service, retired to training units and second-line duties. But the combat statistics told an extraordinary story. In 2 years of combat, gladiators had destroyed over 360 enemy aircraft confirmed, with another 220 probables. They'd flown over 50,000 combat sorties. They'd served in every theater where British forces fought, and they'd done all of it while being dismissed as obsolete from the day they entered service. The loss rate told an equally important story. Of approximately 400 gladiators built, 175 were lost to enemy action. That's a loss rate of 43%, high but not catastrophic considering the aircraft's obsolescence. More importantly, pilot losses were proportionally much lower. The Gladiator's toughness brought damaged aircraft home, saving pilot lives even when the plane itself was beyond repair. Squadron leader Marmaduke Paddle never lived to see the Gladiator's retirement. On April 20th, 1941, while flying a hurricane over Greece, he was shot down and killed. He was 26 years old. His confirmed victory total stood at least 40, possibly 50. Most of those kills came while flying the obsolete Gladiator. At his funeral, a fellow pilot said, "Paddle made that biplane sing." He proved that in the right hands, an obsolete aircraft flown by a superior pilot would defeat a modern aircraft flown by an average one. The Gladiator was a relic, but Paddle made it a weapon. The German pilots who faced Gladiators never forgot the experience. In post-war interviews, former Luftwaffe aces consistently identified British Gladiator pilots as among the most skilled and aggressive opponents they encountered. The obsolete aircraft had earned respect through the courage of the men who flew it. Hauptmann Wolfgang Falk, a Luftwaffe night fighter ace, encountered Gladiators over Norway and wrote in his memoirs, "We expected easy victories against the British biplanes. Instead, we found pilots who fought with desperate courage and surprising skill. The aircraft was obsolete, but the men flying it were anything but. They taught us that technological superiority means nothing without the will to use it effectively." The final irony of the Gladiator story came after the war, when historians began examining combat records. The obsolete biplane that everyone dismissed had actually achieved a better kill-to-loss ratio than many supposedly superior aircraft. In the Middle East theater, Gladiators achieved nearly 3 kills for every loss. In Greece, the ratio exceeded 4-1 during Paddle's tenure. More significantly, the Gladiator had performed when Britain had nothing else. In the desperate summer of 1940, those 137 obsolete biplanes had filled gaps that would have been fatal openings otherwise. They'd held the line at Malta when invasion seemed imminent. They'd established air superiority over Greece against overwhelming odds. They'd protected the desert flank when modern fighters were needed elsewhere. The story of the Gladiator is ultimately about the men, not the machine. The aircraft was genuinely obsolete, a relic from aviation's past, thrust into a modern war, but it was flown by pilots of exceptional skill and courage who refused to accept that obsolescence meant defeat. They took an aircraft everyone laughed at and forged it into a weapon through sheer determination. Flight Lieutenant George Burgess, who flew Gladiators at Malta and survived the war, reflected on the experience in a 1975 interview. "The Gladiator was slow, old-fashioned, and outclassed by everything the enemy flew. We knew it. The Germans knew it. But we also knew that if we could force them into a turning fight at low altitude, we could win. So that's what we did. We'd dive away from their attacks using our only advantage, maneuverability. Then we'd turn inside them and shoot them down. The Germans laughed at us at first, called us flying museums, but after we'd shot down a few of their modern fighters with our antique biplane, they stopped laughing. They learned to respect the Gladiator, not because it was a good aircraft. It wasn't, but because it was flown by men who refused to quit." In 1985, at a reunion of Battle of Britain veterans in London, several former Luftwaffe pilots were invited as guests of honor. One of them, a retired general who had flown Messerschmitts over France and England, was shown a restored Gladiator at the RAF Museum. He stood before the fabric-covered biplane for several minutes without speaking. Finally, he said in careful English, "We called them doppeldecker, double wingers. We thought they would be easy victories. But the men who flew these aircraft were anything but easy. They had courage we could respect and skill we learned to fear. This was not a modern aircraft, but in the right hands it was deadly. We lost many good pilots learning that lesson." The museum curator asked if he'd ever personally fought against gladiators. The German pilot nodded slowly. "Twice. Over France in 1940. Both times, the British pilot forced me into a turning fight at low altitude, where his biplane's maneuverability gave him the advantage. Both times, I barely escaped with my life. I learned to avoid gladiators after that. Other pilots who didn't learn that lesson did not survive." The last Gladiator combat mission flew from Hal Far Airfield in Malta on April 26, 1942, more than 2 years after the aircraft had been declared obsolete. By then, Spitfires and Hurricanes had taken over the island's defense. But one final Gladiator remained operational, maintained by a crew who refused to let her die. When Italian bombers appeared that morning, the Spitfire squadrons were refueling. Someone needed to intercept immediately. Pilot Officer John Waters, who had joined the RAF in 1941 and never flown a Gladiator in combat, volunteered. The ground crew pushed the old biplane onto the runway. Waters took off into hostile skies in an aircraft that had been obsolete before he learned to fly. He intercepted the Italian formation at 8,000 feet. The bombers, escorted by modern Machi fighters, should have massacred the lone biplane. Instead, Waters used the Gladiator's tight turning radius to evade the escort fighters and positioned himself perfectly below the bomber formation. One long burst from 50 yards, one Italian bomber smoking and falling away. Then Waters dove for the deck, using the biplane's maneuverability to escape before the fighters could react. That final Gladiator victory, recorded in Malta's combat logs, closed the book on an aircraft that everyone had underestimated. The biplane that Germany dismissed as a flying museum had fought for 3 years across every theater of war. It had destroyed hundreds of enemy aircraft. It had protected Britain during her darkest hour. And it had proven that courage and skill could overcome technological disadvantage. The Germans had laughed at Britain's worst fighter, but the laughter died over Malta, Greece, the Western Desert, and frozen Norwegian fjords. The obsolete biplane had changed everything by refusing to accept defeat. In the hands of pilots who would not quit, the Gladiator had become something no one expected, a weapon that won respect through sheer determination. The restored Gladiator at the RAF Museum Hendon stands today as testament to an unlikely warrior. Its fabric wings, stretched tight over metal framework, seem impossibly fragile. Its fixed landing gear looks quaint compared to sleek modern jets. But the bullet hole patches visible on close inspection tell the real story. This was an aircraft that fought and bled and brought its pilots home. The placard beside the aircraft reads simply, "Gloucester Gladiator, Britain's last biplane fighter, obsolete on arrival, yet fought with distinction in every theater of World War II. Not the best aircraft, but flown by the best men." That's the truth the Germans learned too late. You can laugh at an obsolete weapon, but if it's wielded by warriors who refuse to accept defeat, that weapon becomes something else entirely. The Gladiator didn't win the war. But in Britain's darkest hour, when modern fighters were in desperately short supply, this flying anachronism held the line. The old pilots who flew her never forgot. And the Germans who survived facing her learned a lesson that transcends technology. Courage and skill matter more than specifications. The obsolete biplane taught that lesson at gunpoint, one turning fight at a time, until even Germany's best pilots learned to respect Britain's worst fighter.